Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar called From Paper to Screen, How the Digital SAT and ACT Impact Preparation. And this is brought to you by CollegeAdvisor as well as Curve Breakers. So you'll have the opportunity to learn more about Curve Breakers as I'm now going to introduce our presenter for our webinar.
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everybody. Hope everyone's having a good night. My name is Nick Lapoma. I am the owner of Curve Breakers Test Prep. We are a company over in Long Island, New York, and we help students, families, and schools with all aspects of the SAT and ACT process. As you probably have heard, the SAT and ACT have gone to a digital direction. So I'm going to be going over tonight like what that looks like, how it affects preparation, and how it affects the process at large. So I'm going to get into all the ins and outs of both digital tests that now exist.
Nice. I'm really eager to learn more about this. As you know, the formatting has changed, and Nick has a great presentation in store for you all. Before we get started into the content of our webinar, we would like to get a sense of what grade you are in. I've already launched the poll, so if you can go ahead and place your responses in. And we will, okay. So far for our live audience, we have 67% that are in the 10th grade, and then we have 33% that are other. So that's just who our live audience is for this evening, Nick. So with that, I will turn it over to you, and you can tell us a little bit about your company.
Of course. So yeah, as I said earlier, I'm the founder of Curve Breakers. It is a private test prep company for students, families, and schools. Part of my goal in starting this company was to provide resources for all students when it comes to standardized tests. One of the big, issues with standardized testing in general is access to information. So many students don't have access to the right information. They maybe don't have the funds to pay for the thousands of dollars of tutoring that some people do. Of course, obviously those things help, but at the end of the day, what my goal is with my company is to provide access to a large group of students and really give them the opportunities that they deserve. We're very proud to be partners with a large number of very prominent school districts. So we have contracts and schools that we work with in the New York City Department of Education. We're also partnered with other districts around the nation. We work with a ton of different schools and honestly thousands of students every year to help them with this process. It is unfortunately a very complicated process. I think over the past few years, it's only gotten more complicated. I think everyone's hope is that this process would maybe be streamlined a little bit, right? Maybe get a little bit easier, a little bit less stressful. That was like maybe one of the core goals of the test optional movement, which of course I'll be discussing tonight. But at the end of the day, it's actually become quite difficult and complicated to navigate. And that's why I exist, right? Like my goal is to really help guide parents and students through this, to show people what the best methodologies are and what's the best way to handle all of this. And I'm going to kind of go into that, like what the right approach is. And, a lot of what we do is in our work with schools and students is utilizing data. So a big part of what we do is to really look at what makes students perform well on something like the SAT. And we've really identified that through data collection with our school partners, case studies, and that's information that I can provide to you guys. Like there's things that work and there's things that maybe work, right? And we want to gear ourselves towards the things that definitely work for a majority of students. And that's kind of the information that I'm going to be providing today. So what is the new SAT like? As you may have heard, the SAT changed in March of 2024 to an all digital format. There is no paper option. So you used to be able to obviously we all remember back when we did the SAT, if you're a parent, paper and pencil, Scantron exam. Now it is an entirely app-based digital test. So basically the test is done entirely on a computer and it's utilizing what we call adaptive testing. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Some of the big changes that they made to the test are positive, and I'm going to go over those first. So one of the big ones is they did shorten the test. So we all remember, any parents out there, it was a long test, right? We're talking 3+ hours, a very, arduous grind, we'll call it, to finish the SAT. And now they've actually shortened the test to 2 hours and 14 minutes, which is a much more appealing time frame for students. It's just, if we're talking about chopping off about 45 minutes of a hard test. That last 45 minutes is probably like the most painful part of the whole thing. So that makes the test feel a lot different. And I think students have really indicated that to me over the years, over the last year, pretty much, that they really like the fact that the test has been shortened. And also the questions have been shortened to some degree. So we no longer have the super long passages. We have shorter passages, which is, once again, much more appealing to today's student. We have two sections on the exam. We have English and math, basically. There's two modules for each section, so that's a little bit misleading. So there's really four parts to the test: Module 1 and Module 2 of English, Module 1 and Module 2 of math. One of the big positive changes they also made was to allow you to use a calculator on the entire part of the math section. On the old SAT, prior to March of 2024, there was a part of the test that you could not use a calculator on. Students found that to be just very disruptive and frustrating. Many students use calculators actively in school. Some schools don't allow students to use calculators at certain points in time, and those students tended to perform better on that part of the test. But many students are just allowed to use a calculator whenever they need it. And for those students, that was very challenging to have to have that removed and have to do arithmetic by hand. And that was just something that students weren't used to doing. And it's kind of silly if you think about it. I mean, like, we have these tools, right? So like, why are we going to make students do things without a calculator when we all know we're using those things all the time? So it was a little bit silly. So they removed that from the test. Like I said earlier, they did a great job of shortening the passages, which I think was very effective in making the test a little bit more appealing to students. They've also shortened slightly the window of time that it takes to get your scores. It's still not great. They were really saying that it was going to be very short, like it was going to be a few days, but it ends up being a little bit longer than they first said. But it's still like reasonable time. Like, you might get it back in like 10 days or something like that. And then the big one, now we're down to the negative here. They've discontinued the QAS reports. Now, what is that, right? The QAS is the question and answer service. So when you took the SAT prior to March of 2024, so say you took it in 2023 of an older student, or I don't know, someone who took it then, you were able to pay a few extra dollars and access your test paper. Not the exact one that you used on the exam, but basically a digital copy of a standard version of it. But that was great, right? Because you could look at the test paper, you could look at your answers, you could use that to study, you could go over it with a teacher, with a parent, with a tutor, on your own. And that was a really great learning experience for students to like see, what mistakes did I make when I took the real SAT, and now you cannot do that, right? They just do not release the test papers. It's very hidden. And the logic for that is they're saying that they might reuse the questions in the future, but it does make it harder to prepare. And there's ways that we've solved that issue, and I'll go over those later. But that is definitely like the big negative. If I had to point out one huge negative, number one would be discontinuing those, because so many students use that as a very low cost way to get some really good preparation for the exam. And now you can't do that, right? And that's very frustrating to a lot of students. So what are the things that have stayed the same about the SAT? So the scoring is still the same, right? We still have the 1600 score. Some of you may remember there was a period of time where they had a 2400 score. Those days are gone. We're back to the very familiar 1600 score. You have 800 points for English, 800 points for math. That's a familiar thing. One thing I would say about that, and one challenge I would say that I see with students and parents, is that the score numbers have changed. Even though like the scoring of the SAT itself is the same, like the maximum is 1600, what colleges want and what is a quote unquote good score, there is really no answer to what is a good score, but what may be accepted by certain colleges has changed a lot. So if you talk to parents, like I can think back to high school friends of mine that got into X, Y, and Z college, or myself got into these colleges and these scholarships with these numbers, like say a 1200 in 2004. When I did this, that would get you into a lot of the top colleges in the country. 1200, 1250, you would really be in great shape. Now, not to say that that's a bad score, but a lot of the top colleges, the top 50 schools, that's not going to be a submittable score. Like a 1200 range score is not going to benefit you for a lot of the top schools, where you might now need something in the 1400s. So even though the scoring of the SAT itself is the same, it's still out of 1600, what is needed or required or useful in many instances has changed a lot. And that's like kind of a differentiation between what's in parents' mind and what's the reality now. It's like, well, when I was in high school, I got a X score on the SAT, and I was able to get into all these schools. And that just may not be the case now, and that, I think that's a challenging part of it. The math section still does have the quote unquote grid-ins that fill in the blanks. They're not multiple choice. You have to type in the number now. So those are still on the test. That was one of the things that they left that some students don't like. Basically, you don't have the multiple choice to work with. There's a lot of strategies you can use with multiple choice to get an answer. If you don't know exactly what to do, you cannot do that on those problems, and that's probably why they include them. And then the reading comprehension questions, even though the style of the questions is extremely different, the underpinnings of the questions are largely the same. You're reading passages for context. You have to understand, main points and so on and so forth. So it's largely a similar kind of test, but just in a different format. One of the big things that's come up is like they have brought back vocabulary questions on the SAT. So I do have this point at the end about vocabulary lists. Back in the day when I did the SAT in 2004, part of the studying was memorizing vocabulary because there was a huge number of very bizarre vocabulary questions and vocabulary words on the exam. Now what they're doing is gearing the vocabulary words more towards words that students would more likely be familiar with or that should be known for various reasons, like more words that would be applicable in daily life, right? That you might use actually in your writing, or you might need to know when you're reading something. So gone are the crazy vocabulary words that no one needs to know, and they're using like more familiar vocabulary. So instead of memorizing a list of 1,000 words, that's not really going to be an effective strategy for studying for the current version of the SAT. It's very hard to predict what words would be on the exam. So one of the best strategies there is when you're doing your practice, when you're preparing for the SAT, any word you don't know that comes up, you should try to memorize, because obviously if it appeared on the test once, it's very probable that it could appear there again. But I wouldn't waste hours and hours and hours studying vocabulary. Now, I noticed that we did have some 10th graders in the audience. What I would do if I was very early on in the process and I was like a little bit worried about the vocabulary piece and some of the reading comp, I would just start to read, right? Read texts that challenge you, things that are boring. It really is a good way to look at it. Read magazines. You could read The Economist, something like that, like where it's like more of a technical articles. You could read Popular Mechanics, like things like that. Really try to like push the envelope of what you normally would be reading. And if you don't read, it's a good habit to pick up. I think it's not only beneficial for stuff like this, but it's also beneficial for college and for life, right? It really helps expand your vocabulary and increase your ability in that area. So that's definitely something that if I was really early on in the process, I didn't want to actually start preparing for the SAT, but I wanted to better myself for the SAT or ACT, I would just read. So let's go over the timing of the exam. This is one of the other big things that's changed. Obviously, we've shortened the exam significantly. The whole timing structure of the exam has to change. So basically, you have 64 minutes, two 32-minute modules for reading and writing, and then 54 questions. For the math, you have 70 minutes split into two 35-minute modules, and there's 44 questions there, so there's 22 on each module. So you can see the total of 2 hours and 14 minutes, and the total number of questions is 98. Now, why is that important? Well, when we're comparing SAT to ACT, the ACT as it stands right now is much longer test with significantly more questions. So you have a very small amount of time per question on the ACT when you compare it to the SAT. So you can see the SAT provides 68% more time per question when compared to the ACT. And that is a big deal breaker for a lot of students. When I go into like comparing the two exams, that really plays a very big part. Now the ACT is changing, right? So that is going to change, and I'm going to explain how the ACT is changing. They realize that this is a big weakness of their exam. There's a lot of students that just physically cannot finish the ACT, right? And then those students, if they were coming to Curve Breakers, they were talking to me, we would have them do diagnostic tests of the SAT and the ACT. We would figure out which one they're naturally better at, and we would route them towards the test that they'd be more successful on, would yield a higher score, right? So if a student's doing that analysis, they're trying both tests, and they don't really like the timing of the ACT, they're not going to want to do it. And the ACT has realized that. I think they've lost, a bit of market share to the SAT because of the changes have been very positively, reviewed by students, as positively as it could be for a standardized test, right? I think, I talk to hundreds of students, hundreds of families. We work with thousands of students across all the school partners and all that. So I've heard a lot of feedback on these tests. And I would say, like in our office here, or like on a Zoom call with a family that we're talking about tutoring the students, 99% of the time, regardless of how the student performs on the two tests, they prefer the SAT. And if you think about it, like if I was a 16-year-old, would I prefer a 2-hour test with 98 questions or a 3+ hour test with 215 questions? And it's kind of a no-brainer. Like, what student would subject themselves to this much longer test with, more than double the questions? Not many, right? The only students that would say they would want to do that were the students that were like really focused on their score and realized that they did much better on the ACT and like, all right, you know what, I'll deal with the ACT because I'm just better at it. That's a very small percentage of students that would be able to think that way in that context, right? So it is a very important part of the process. I do recommend that any student looking at taking these tests try both, not in an official setting, because then you're putting on paper probably a low score because you haven't really prepared, but in a practice setting. And that's a service that we provide free of charge to any person anywhere. Is like we administer these free diagnostic tests and tell you exactly how you did. So that's definitely an important part of the process. So now let's get into the adaptive testing piece. This is a slide that really explains how that works. So let's just say everyone here is taking the SAT, right? We start the test, we start module 1 of the English portion of the test, and we complete that portion. Now, depending on how we performed on that first module. Now, remember, we're doing the test on a computer. So there's a very brief break where the computer grades how we did on that first module. If we do really well on that first module, we're going to be given a harder second module, significantly harder. If we don't do that well on the first module, we're going to be given a easier second module. Now, you might say, that doesn't sound too fair. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, right? If you get the harder module, you're going to get a much higher score than the student that gets an easier module. So if you get the easy module 2, you're looking at a hard cap, like the highest you can get somewhere in the 500s, probably in the mid 500s. Like if you ace that second module, maybe you get into the mid 500s. If you get the hard second module, you're looking at a floor of that level, right? So if you bomb the second module, you're probably going to get a higher score than someone that aced the easy second module. So it's in every student's best interest to try to get the hard second module. Now, what is the standard to get that? Well, you probably, it's not exactly known, but the estimate is about 2/3 correct. So if you get, say you get 80% of the questions right on the first module, you're going to be given the hard second module and you're going to get a pretty good score, if not a great score. If you get, say, 50% of the questions right in the first module, you're going to be given the easier second module, and your score will be more in the range of what I said earlier, probably be in the 400 to 5 something range. So depending on your goals, there are some students that may be fine with an easy module score, but most students that are applying for college admissions, they're using the SAT to apply to college. You look on the websites of the schools, you see those 1300s, 1400s, 1500s that the schools want. You have to get the hard module on both parts of the test. And that's just a hugely important part of preparing for the test. And it does cause a lot of score fluctuations for students, right? If you fall one question below the hard module, your score might be a little bit lower. If you fall one question above into the hard module and you get the hard module, your scores will be much better. So that one question could really dictate your score to a very great degree, right? So it's a little bit confusing and it's a little bit frustrating at first, but once you kind of understand the system, and part of way students can understand that is by doing practice tests, doing diagnostics, really understanding how it works. Understanding how this all works is half the battle. That's why we're here tonight, right? Like, I'm trying to give you guys a rundown of how all this stuff works. That is very important because students that understand how this works can use that to their advantage, right? So that's pretty much how it works. So this is a visualization of what the paper SAT used to look like. This long passage here. This actually would have been this entire page. So you would have 3 full columns of reading, and then there would have been 10 questions. I just couldn't fit it on the slide, but you would have this very long passage and then 10 questions. This is the old SAT. This is not what it looks like now. I'm going to get to that next. The reason that this was challenging and why students didn't like this is that if a student read this long passage about some boring thing, right, and they don't really understand it, they don't connect with it, then they feel that 10 questions are now at risk, right? And that's a huge problem, right? You don't want to have 10 questions now that I can't understand. That actually is not the case. You can still get some of them if you don't understand the passage, but it was frustrating, and it was definitely a source of discomfort for students. So what they did was they changed it to something like this, right? So this is a note-taking kind of question where you have bullet-pointed notes, and that's very interesting because that's more of like a school thing, right? Like note-taking, right? What can I glean from these notes? Right. So they tried to make the test a little bit more relevant, a little bit more, familiar for students. And also you can see this is a short prompt, right? You just have to read this one little thing and answer this one question. So say you didn't understand this one passage. Okay, no big deal. Maybe I don't understand this one question, but I can just move on to the next one. It's a totally new thing, and I won't have a problem with it. This is another example of the kind of question they ask on the new digital SAT. So you can see this is one of those vocabulary questions, and you can see the nature of the vocabulary. Like I was mentioning earlier, we have the words widespread, careful, unintended, and infrequent. Those are words that I imagine most students probably know. And those are like usable words, right? Those are real words that you might actually have to use, not some wild vocabulary that would only exist in a dictionary, right? So it's very familiar words, and there's a lot of strategies that go into this kind of question, and that's kind of what you're looking for when you're looking for services for SAT, ACT. You want someone who's going to really tell you how to take the test. What are the strategies? What are the tips? What are the tricks? And these kind of questions, there's a lot of those kind of things. So this is an example of what the actual app looks like that you take the digital SAT on. It's called Blue Book. You can see you have a test preview. You would have your upcoming tests here. You have full-length practice tests that they have on the app. So you can actually do practice tests on the Blue Book app. So I would suggest any student that wants to start practicing for the SAT, you can download Blue Book. It's totally free, and you can do some of the practice tests. People in the industry, and in my industry, the SAT prep industry, have very much so criticized the tests that they've released because students have really said that the actual tests feel different than these tests, especially the first few they released. So that's why there's like a lot of outside vendors and websites and sources of questions that you can utilize. We do have a testing platform for students so they can do practice tests that has thousands of practice problems in them, categorized by question type. We assign homework and quizzes and so on and so forth in. But this is a free thing, right? So I always encourage people to utilize free resources when they can. And this is a very good free resource. Just have to be aware that the test quality on some of the tests has been criticized. Like students have gotten very high scores on these practice tests on this thing, and then they go into the real test and they do not get the same kind of score. There's a lot of reasons that could happen, but I think I do agree. The first few tests they released were definitely not the best, and that was definitely challenging for students this past year, but it's being reduced. Have another poll.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Give you a short break, Nick, because you are sharing a lot of great information with our audience. I'm learning a lot. So with that audience, we would like to get a sense of, we're speaking about the SAT and the ACT, but we want to know, where are you in the college application process? So I know that we have 10th graders that are in the live audience, and we know that the process starts much sooner than the summer going into your senior year. So we would like to hear from you. Let's see. We'll give the responses a few more seconds to come on in. Okay. There they go. Okay, so for our audience, we have 100% of our audience that are in the research phase, which makes sense, for our students who are here with us this evening. We have one more response that they haven't started yet. So with that, Nick, I will turn it back over to you to take us into the second portion of our presentation.
Thank you. All right, let's get into now the ACT, right? So the ACT is changing as well. And that it's the way they're changing it is a little bit different. So when the SAT changed in March of 2024, what they did was they just had a hard stop. So in March of 2024, the test changed to the digital SAT. There is no paper option. You cannot take the test on paper, and everyone had to start doing this new SAT. As you can see here from the little arrows on the bottom, there's more of like a rollout of the ACT changes. So I'm going to go over that first, and I'll get to the bullet points in a second. So the first thing they're doing is in April, so very shortly, the online ACT, which does already exist, will be changing to the new format of the test. So there's a new ACT coming out, and they're starting it with the digital ACT in April. Then in September of this year, the paper ACT is going to change to this new format. And it's going to be the same test, digital and paper, and that's going to be a choice that you as a student can make, right? So you can choose to take it on paper, you can choose to take it on a digital platform on a computer, but in both instances in September, it will be the same style of test, the same format, just going to be a different delivery medium, right? So it's either going to be paper or digital, but you're going to be doing the same test, right? So that's a little bit confusing. Like, why are they changing it early for the digital test and then later for the paper test? That I don't know the exact answer to. I think a lot of it has to do with like what's more popular, where the volume is, and maybe testing it out a little bit, seeing how things work. Where, before they like hard launch a test to 1 million kids, make sure it works right. Like, make sure everything goes smoothly, make sure people like it. I think there's just a lot of reasons they're doing that. And then in spring of 2026, they're changing the state and district testing. So that's where students do in-school tests, like on a Wednesday or something like that. Most of the other changes have to do with the weekend test, the Saturday test that students can take. So what are the actual changes? I'm saying that the format of the ACT is changing. What are those changes? So the science section is becoming optional, right? So that's something you can take, but it will not affect your composite score. Your composite score is your quote unquote score, right? Someone asks you, what did you get on the ACT? You tell them your composite score. I got a 30 on the ACT. That's I'm telling them my composite score. Someone wanted to know every section. You can give them all the sections, but that's basically your ACT score. So the science part will not be a part of that. It will be its own score. So when you take the ACT with the optional science, you will have your score for English, your score for math, your score for reading, and your composite score. And then those three will average out to your composite score. So the way you get your composite score on the ACT is you add up all of your sections and you divide by the number of sections. So now with the new ACT being 3 sections, English, math, and reading, you will add those 3 scores up, you will divide by 3, and that will be your composite score. The science part will just be its own score, right? So it's very questionable what colleges will do with that. Maybe they'll want it for STEM programs or for certain majors. Maybe they won't want it at all. Who knows? I mean, that's yet to be seen. Many people in this industry that I'm in have made various hypotheses about what will happen. Some people think it will still be important. Others think it will die completely. We don't know yet. I think it's yet to be seen. And they're shortening the test, right? So they're shortening the test to 125 minutes, which is, of course, 2 hours and 5 minutes. You can see the battle going on here, right? The SAT, 2 hours and 14 minutes. Now the ACT changes in response, 2 hours and 5 minutes. So this is a battle to make the shortest test that still works. And they're definitely shortening the number of questions. There still will be significantly more questions on the ACT than the SAT. They're also, one weird quirk of the ACT right now, that the math part has 5 multiple choice answers instead of 4. So they're knocking that down to 4. That was kind of pointless. It just made it a little bit harder to guess. There's some reasons for that. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but that's definitely a positive change. Shorter passages, once again, trying to compete with the SAT, the short passages, they're going to make them a little bit shorter. And then we're going to have more time per question, which is hugely important because that's one of the biggest issues with the ACT. I still think students are going to struggle with the time a little bit on the ACT. So you look at yourself, you think like, okay, which one's better for me? Obviously, trying both is the best way. But if you said to yourself, well, I think, I really like to move quickly. I don't like to think about things too much. You might be better suited for the ACT. If you said to yourself, you know what, I really like to think things through. I don't like to be rushed. Then you're probably a better candidate for the SAT. So like I said, the scoring will remain the same 36 level score. The composite score will now be the average of the 3 parts that still exist. and the science will be optional. We still have the option of paper or digital. I think that's hugely important. And the digital test, since the two are the same, the digital ACT will not be an adaptive test. So they're not doing the adaptive testing thing. You don't have to worry about the modules, module 1, hard module 2, whatever. That is a positive, right? That definitely a source of confusion for parents and students that they're removing. But then they add in a different source of confusion is, should I take it on paper or should I take it digitally, right? I was like, how do I know which one I should do? That's a very good question. Company like Curve Breakers, we provide all the resources to students. We're going to be giving students digital ACTs, paper ACTs, digital SATs. We're going to be able to figure out which one is the right decision. I always say there's not really a great way to figure it out other than to actually just try it, right? Like you have to see how you perform. We can hypothesize all day. I can give you all the reasons why someone would do well on one thing or the other, but that's not usually the most helpful. So why did they do this, right? I'll give you the real reason before I give you these canned responses from the ACT. The real reason is that the SAT was very well received by students. Students really liked it, and they decided we have to compete with that. I think they were just waiting to see what would happen with the digital SAT. Would it be really good and students would really like it and want to do that? Or would it totally flop, bomb, and like no one wants to do it, and then we're just not going to change the ACT, right? So the latter option, the flopping, the bomb, that didn't happen, right? The SAT has been well received, so then they had to change their test very quickly. So I think that's kind of how it happened. If I had to really guess the real reason, but what do they say? This is actually from the ACT. They want students to have options to do science or not, have the flexibility, demonstrate their capabilities, not be so restricted by time, tailor their testing experience, like picking different parts of the test. Really my reason on the bottom and bold, that's the real reason, right? They don't want to lose to the SAT. And then they kind of made the determinations about what to change by probably polling students, right? Talking to parents, talking to teachers, talking to school administrators. What do people not like about the ACT? It's very easy to give this list of things, right? The timing, you see number one, and this is also from the ACT. I can't finish the test. Like, that's a terrible feeling, right? You're doing a standardized test, you can't finish. People just do not like that, right? And it also very significantly affects your score, right? Another thing, I don't like the science section. There's a big difference between the two tests. Like, there is no science section on the SAT. Like, I don't like that. Okay, great. Here, take it if you want. Don't take it if you don't want to, right? I do want to show off my science skills. Okay, great. Take the science. I don't want to test on a computer. Okay, great. We're going to keep the paper test around, and we'll also have a digital test for the students that want to do a test on the computer. All right, let's see. So the ACT format. So you can see the current format on the left. You see a lot of questions and a very short amount of time. You see you have less than a minute per question on pretty much a majority of the test, or around a minute a question. Slightly over on well, actually, no, it's less than a minute a question on almost all the parts of the test. So that is a huge challenge, right? Students really struggle to finish that. And you can see on the right is where we do get into the territory of some of the parts of the test having a little bit more than a minute a question. So, they've improved it a little bit, right? They've definitely turned down the speed slightly, but they definitely didn't turn it down all the way. As you can tell from these numbers, still feels to me like there's going to be some students that do have a time issue with the ACT. But if you're doing the ACT, there's just one thing you have to prepare for, and there's strategies you can use. There's ways you can work around that. One of the other big things is that because of this, right? Like, you're probably thinking, Nick, like, if the ACT gives you so little time, how is that fair? Well, the questions have to be a little bit more straightforward, a little bit easier. So you do find if you compare SAT to ACT without time involved, the ACT questions are definitely a little bit easier. Most students would agree with that. That's just because there's restricted time, right? On the SAT here, we're giving you a lot of time. Here's a harder question, so some students don't like doing the more challenging questions and prefer the more straightforward nature of the ACT. This is a little FAQ that the ACT kind of put out. Like I said, we don't have an adaptive test. Super scoring will still work largely the same way. There'll be different price if you do the science or not. This is all available on the ACT website, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that. So now this is an important comparison. So this is how we can look at what are the differences between the tests. I would encourage you to take a screen grab or take a picture of this. This really shows you what the difference is between the digital SAT the ACT, and then the new changed ACT. So I kind of went over all the different reasons, so it's all here in one nice place. And then here are some more reasons, more ways we changed it. A lot of the changes, obviously, when you change a test, the companies that make these tests have to release all new materials. They do have books, right? They have SAT and ACT books released by the organizations. Those books have fewer tests in them. The platforms have fewer tests, fewer questions, because the test is new. So that was a challenge with the digital SAT. There wasn't a lot of material, but now there's much more. So now there's up to 10 tests for the digital SAT. And for the ACT, right now, they just have one. So that is definitely a problem, but I'm sure they're going to increase that number because they got to sell their books, you know. But at the end of the day, like, I hope they do release more tests, because a lot of students do use those tests to prepare for the exam. So let's talk about the preparation, right? Now that the SAT, I'm just going to use that as an example. Now the SAT is digital. If you're doing a class, you have a tutor, you're preparing for this test, and you're not using a digital platform, you are putting yourself significantly behind. You must practice on the digital platform. You must practice with the tools they give you. You need to understand the scoring. Like, all that comes from the digital platform, having it be adaptive, all that stuff. Someone hands you a piece of paper, yeah, that's great for practice. But at the end of the day, it doesn't have the adaptive stuff. It's not really preparing the students properly for the exam. So you really need a platform. We provide that service, something we can provide. Also, for students to get an approximation of their score, they would also need to really use a platform. You can do it on paper, but it's just not as effective, right? So I really stress that, you know, because diagnostic testing is such a big part of preparing for these tests, that's one of the biggest parts, right? You got to know the content of the exam, you know, the math formulas, grammar rules. You need to obviously do practice, understand the questions, strategies, so on and so forth. Obviously, that's really important, strategizing on the test. But the big one, the big extra one, is you really need to sit down and do complete practice tests, because the timing and the endurance is so important. So that's why I'm stressing that. Like I said earlier, we do provide free diagnostic testing for all students. I highly encourage people to seek out that kind of thing, and you could do it on Blue Book, like I said. How should we prepare for this test? Try both tests before you get started. You don't want to waste a lot of time doing a test that maybe you're not going to be as successful on. Try both tests, do the diagnostic testing, figure out which path is better for you. Use the free resources that are available. Use Khan Academy, use the College Board Blue Book, use all that stuff. I encourage people to use it. It's free, definitely doesn't hurt. Obviously, there's better stuff. There's online courses that we have all kinds of things, you know, like tons of different companies have all kinds of paid stuff. What you do want to be careful of is things like really shady sounding guarantees. Like, there are some guarantees that are totally legitimate. Like, you know, if you don't go up X points, and you do all the homework, you come to all the classes, we will give you X, Y, and Z refund, whatever. You just want to be careful the ones that have like 10 pages of fine print, because that usually just means you're never going to get any retribution, right? So just be careful with that. And then practice makes perfect, right? The more you practice on these kind of tests, the better you're going to do. It's just a fact. So here is what the diagnostic testing platforms look like. This is what our diagnostic testing platforms look like for SAT on the left and for ACT on the right. ACT, of course, is going to change because we need the digital ACT platform, but you can see this is data, right? We're simulating a real testing environment. You're getting feedback. How much time did you spend on a question? Which ones did you get right and wrong? What categories of questions did you get wrong? Do you get easy questions wrong, or you're making silly mistakes, or do you get hard questions wrong, or you need to maybe learn some of the content, learn better strategies, right? This is hugely important to understanding how to take this kind of test. So when you're thinking about preparing for something like the SAT or ACT, you want to take into consider your own personal learning style, how much time you have, what your budget is, and like what score you need, right? So if I take a diagnostic test and I get a 1200 and my target school needs a 1400, that may take a decent amount of work, right? But if I had a 1350 and my target school needed a 1400, I probably need much less work than the student that needs to increase 200 points. You can increase that much. You can increase significantly more than that. It just takes time and effort, right? That's what I always tell you. Like, what's the maximum minimum people can improve? Kids have improved hundreds and hundreds of points. They just go through a lot of time and effort to get there, right? So if you want to improve 400 points, that's definitely going to be challenging, but I've seen students do it, right? Everybody is not going to do that, but some students definitely will. And it's just going to be months and months of effort, lots of practice questions, lots of diagnostic tests. You know, if you have a particular personal question, feel free to reach out to me. I'll tell you exactly what to do, how students have done it and what they do. But you just want to be really careful in setting reasonable expectations and goals, which really just need to align how much time you can spend on this and what your goals are. So let's go over self-study. If you're a motivated student, you feel like you could really self-direct yourself, that is a great avenue. There are a lot of free resources, Blue Book, Khan Academy, stuff on the ACT website, low cost books and products online. There's a lot of things you can do there. But if you're not so self-directed, sometimes that can be challenging. A lot of students do need help. Then you have group classes. Those are better for students who maybe have a certain budget to prepare for the test. They do provide a lot of strategies. They do provide a lot of practice questions, practice problems. They might be available at your school. They might be available in your local community. They might be available online. You can do online classes. A lot of companies like mine and many other companies, they're great. You just do need some self-directed learning. And then the last option would be private tutoring. That's where you're really getting into something that's very expensive, but there can be a lot of benefits to that. You do want to make sure that you have someone that's a good fit for your student and really is going to be helpful to them. And then my last one I'll go through quickly. Does the SAT still matter? Obviously, you've probably heard a lot of schools are going back to requiring the SAT. If you don't, I look at it this way. I'll make this slide very quick. This is a no-risk situation. If you don't do well on the SAT, there's plenty of schools that will take you without an SAT score. If you do well on the SAT or ACT, it does open up a lot of doors. You can get scholarships, all that good stuff. So I would go into it with an eyes wide open approach. Whereas if I do great, I'm going to try to do great. But if I don't, it's not a big deal. And I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. So audience, we are now going to go into our live questions and answers. Just to let you all know that the handout or the presentation that Nick just provided is actually downloadable by visiting the handouts tab. I know there was a section in there that was really important that did the comparison, so you all can definitely download the slides. So we're going to move into our questions and answers. So the first question that I have, and these are generated from our audience when they registered, is when should I begin test preparation?
That's a great question. A lot of that just depends on, I'll give you the average of when you should prepare, but a lot of that depends on where you're starting and where you need to end up. So like my example earlier, if I just need to go up 50, 100 points, I probably could start, 2-3 months before my actual test. Right? Most students are taking the SAT. Most popular time would be in March, the spring of junior year. A lot of students do take it significantly earlier than that. Like they take it in the fall, winter of their junior year, right? If I need to go up a lot, if I want to get a very high score, I'm applying to elite colleges that need high scores. Maybe I have a bigger, bridge to gap here. Then you probably want to give yourself more like maybe 6 to 9 months. Some students study for a year. This is a very personalized process, depends on your goals, depends on where you're starting, where you want to end up. But I would say if I had to give you the average, the best time to prepare is the summer going into 11th grade or sometime in 10th grade, take the diagnostic test, because then you can see, okay, what do I need to do? Do I have a long way to go, or am I pretty close? Am I doing well? And then you can kind of dictate your schedule from that.
Great. Our next question is, if I've maybe already taken the paper version of the SAT or the ACT, is it okay to kind of mix scores, like anything around super scoring that you might be able to share?
Yeah, they've said that, well, when the SAT changed in March of 2024, colleges did say they would accept both scores and they would super score them. It'll probably be the same thing for the ACT. It'll just be a little bit awkward because one of the sections will be missing. But I think at the end of the day, colleges are most interested in just getting really high scores from students. So I don't think that'll be a problem.
Okay. And so speaking of high scores, question comes up all the time is how one can boost their SAT scores. So perhaps this was how can they get from 1590 to 600 score within the SAT?
Yeah, the best way to improve your score is, number one, to diagnose what your issues are. Okay, what mistakes am I making? Am I making mistakes on grammar questions, reading comp, geometry, algebra? Understand what mistakes you're making. That's where the diagnostic test comes into play. And then the trifecta of effective SAT prep is obviously practice problems, strategizing, and diagnostic tests, right? You have to understand the content of the exam, the formulas, the grammar rules. You got to study all that stuff, but you really need to do timed practice. You need to diagnose yourself and like kind of chip away at the things that you make mistakes on. If you want to get a very high score, realistically, the thing you need to do is really, once again, see it happen on a practice test. It's not going to occur where a student like takes a practice test and gets a 1300 and then goes into the real SAT and gets a 1550. Like that's just very unlikely to happen. So the best way to like get to that point is to slowly build your score by studying and doing practice tests, build it up, and then once you do a practice test or a diagnostic test and you get that kind of score, you're more than capable of getting it on the real test. It just takes time. I think if you want a really high score, it takes time. But just another little aside, you don't need to have a 1590 or 1600. If you have anything over 1550, pretty much any college in the nation will accept you. Obviously, there's a whole lot of other things we can talk about that you need: AP classes, high grades, essay, blah, blah. So there's no guarantee that just because you have a high test score, you're going to be taken to any college. So it's part of the process.
Yes, thank you for affirming that for our students. Our next question is, are there two different types of PSAT exams? My friend took the PSAT in the 9th grade.
Yeah, there is. There's an early version PSAT for younger students that doesn't include some of the complicated math. And then even the PSAT itself is like kind of a light version of the SAT. You know, they kind of just turn down the notch of difficulty, like 1 or 2 notches, to make it a little bit more fair for students, because a lot of students are taking the PSAT in 10th grade. They're taking the earlier PSAT in 8th or 9th grade. It just would be unfair to give them, you know, Algebra 2 content that students learn in 10th or 11th grade, right? So yeah, there are different versions.
Okay. The next question says, what happens if my device crashes or my Wi-Fi cuts out during the test?
That's a great question. What happens is the test is actually, the whole thing with Blue Book is it's a software. It's not a website. So the test is downloaded before you take the test onto your device in the software. So if with the Wi-Fi crashes, you can still continue to do the test. And then as long as you connect to the Wi-Fi, like within the next whatever number of hours later, it will still send your test through. So it's capable of doing the test offline. You just need to go back online to continue to send the test in. And then if your device crashes, excuse me, you should just restart your device and then pick up where you left off.
Okay, so this question is more framed from a parent. How can I best support my child at home in preparing for a digital test format, especially if I'm not too familiar really with technology myself?
That's a great question. I think, it's one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. You know, if you go out to a bookstore or you go on Amazon and buy a student a bunch of SAT books, that's definitely helpful, right? But it may not really prepare them for the digital format of the test. So I would, if I wanted to do something that was totally free, I would just have them sit down on Blue Book and do digital SAT tests, and it gives you your score and you can see, what happened there. So just making sure that they're like using the platform, or obviously seeking assistance from some companies that have digital platforms that can show students how to use them, and so on and so forth.
All right, so this question says, what happens if I accidentally click the wrong answer? Can I easily change it without losing time or confusing the system?
Yeah, you just click if you clicked A mistakenly, you could just click B and it will change over. It's very intuitive. Students actually usually don't have very much difficulty utilizing the platform. It's very straightforward, it's very simple. So that's not a big concern.
Great, awesome. If I'm a slow reader or struggle with screen fatigue, how can I prepare myself to stay focused during a digital test?
That's a great question. I mean, one thing I would do if you struggle with screen fatigue is probably consider taking the ACT on paper. But in terms of like how to prepare yourself to stay focused, endurance and focus is a massive part of standardized testing. So many students like kind of wane at the end of these tests. So I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but once again, sitting down for time diagnostic tests, that's the only way you're really, it's like if I had to run a marathon, right? I probably at some point in time would want to run a pretty far distance to test my endurance. running like, 50 feet every day over like the course of a whole year and adding it up to a marathon, that's probably not going to work, right? So you kind of need to like practice how you want to play,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, do colleges scrutinize if a student took the exam more than 3 times?
I would say 99.9% of colleges would not care if you took it 5 times. They just want the highest possible score. There are a select number of schools that you could probably count on one hand that do prefer when students take it a very small number of times, or they will, use that extra information from the other tests to evaluate students. But there's few and far between, like beyond belief. Like it's most colleges, it's a numbers game. They just want the highest score possible. So there's tons of students out there taking it 3, 4, 5 times. I don't know if that's necessarily the greatest thing in the world, but people do it, right? And if you need to do it for whatever reason, that's just what people do, and you know, that's just the world we live in. So that's what it is. But yeah, it doesn't really affect you that much.
Got you.
Georgetown is the big one that doesn't like a huge number of tests.
Yeah. Yeah. Are colleges going to trust the digital SAT, ACT scores the same way they trusted the paper ones, especially during the first few years?
Yeah, they've statistically proven that because of the adaptive testing, it has the exact same efficacy as it used to have. And the fact that colleges are like going back to requiring testing now, or some of them are slowly, that's picking up a lot of steam. That just shows that they do need it. One of the big problems is like, fortunately, like across the country, GPAs are just very wildly inflated and compressed now. So like in some schools that I've seen, the the bottom 25 percentile GPA is like 93 or below. So if you have a 92, you're in the bottom quartile of your high school, in some high schools, of course. So that's a huge problem. That's why the tests are needed.
All righty. Let's see. I think we have a couple more questions. Um, does the faster score turnaround with digital tests give my child a better chance to retest before application deadlines?
Not really. They kind of have organized the test dates to like work with the application deadlines. So the SAT added a September test this year. So they had an extra fall, summer fall test. So they really do have a number of options before the application deadlines are due. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. As long as, especially when you're starting early, that's one of the big benefits of starting early, right? Is that like you have more options for testing, right? And then that's less of an issue.
All right, and this last question, which is something I know that you went over in the presentation. So, how can I know if I should take the SAT or the ACT, just given the changes, and what should I base my choice on?
I would say, once again, sound like a broken record. Try both tests in a diagnostic setting and figure out which one you're better at. Obviously, a lot of students score very equally on the two, and then that's where like experts can come in and tell you which one you could see better progress on. But definitely like the diagnostic testing.
Awesome, awesome. Take both exams. um,
Yes, not officially. At home or at a place or online or something, and you can figure it out pretty easily that way.
Great, awesome. Well, that actually is bringing us now to the end of our webinar. And so, thank you so much, Nick, for sharing more about this new digital format that students have. Some have already started to embrace, and many will go ahead and start to begin. And so, I wanted to just also allow you opportunity if there was more that you wanted to share about curve breakers before we conclude our webinar.
Yeah, thank you once again. This was a pleasure. I love doing these things. I do them all the time at schools and stuff like that. So it's definitely exciting for me. Like I said earlier, like our company is a full scale tutoring company, SAT, ACT, APs, all that good stuff, and we provide the diagnostic testing platforms, high quality tutoring, group classes. We work with schools. So if you want this at your school, want this kind of information, like we do work with a lot of school districts and stuff like that. And personally, like I struggled with the SAT process in the beginning. I eventually ended up with a 99th percentile score, and part of that was because I prepared for the test. I had some help. Luckily, graciously, my parents were able to provide, and these kind of tests benefited me wildly in my life because it helped me get into a really great college, get a huge scholarship. But also, when I went to law school, I'm also a licensed attorney. It really enabled me to get a full scholarship to that as well. So like testing ability is something that has benefited me greatly, and that's why I'm trying to, give that back. And that's like what I'm all about. So thank you.
Nice, nice, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nick, again for even sharing your story, more about your company. And I know that our audience will take advantage by clicking on that QR code where they can gain more access and information about curve breakers. And last but not least, I just wanted to let you all know that here is the link for CollegeAdvisor. So if you are interested in learning more about CollegeAdvisor, please click on this QR code or scan the QR code so that you can sign up for a free strategy session with a specialist from our team, and we can talk more about your academic profile and discuss more opportunities to support you through one-on-one personalized admission support. So with that, everyone, have a great evening, and this presentation will be available tomorrow on our CollegeAdvisor website. Thank you again. Good
Amazing.
night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Nick.
Bye.